Well, I'll start with the land acknowledgement, and that'll give people a couple minutes to come in as well. So welcome to the University of Calgary and to the Faith and Spirituality Center. I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. All right, well, good morning, everyone. For those of you who I don't know or don't know me, I'm Marika Cassis. I'm the head of the Department of Classics and Religion. Your host for this morning should be Paul Verhoff, who's having technical difficulties, so you'll have to pretend I'm Paul. I'm not nearly as fun as Paul, but you'll have to pretend. And so Paul sent me his introduction, so I'm going to read that, and hopefully he'll be able to join us shortly. But in the meantime, I'll introduce our wonderful speaker, Dr. Clooney, and if he's still having trouble, I'll moderate at the end. Otherwise, I'll hand it over to him.
I can step in if you want, Marika, but I'm really liking what you're doing here. So
Paul's here. All right, I will turn it back over to Paul.
Yeah, I'm sorry, my computer is happier now than it was before, but I don't have all my speaking notes, so I sent them to Marika. But anyway, here we go. Welcome to this space, to this place together. Good to be with you. This is part of a long tradition at the University of Calgary, the Craigie Lecture Series. Dr. Peter Craigie was a professor at the University of Calgary, member of the Department of Religious Studies and Dean of the Faculty of Humanities, and at one time the Vice President Academic of the University of Calgary until he died early, tragically in 1985. Just a few years later, the University of Calgary decided to start this lecture series that honors the memory of Dr. Peter Craigie. Every year, a distinguished lecturer is invited to the University of Calgary, or invited by way of Zoom to kind of show up at the University of Calgary in this special year, to share about topics relating religion to life, religion and life. This year it's Dr. Francis X Clooney. You maybe see him there if he's still pinned. I don't know how these things work. I'm sure Sarah will figure it all out for us. Dr. Clooney is the Parkman Professor of Divinity and Professor of Comparative Theology at Harvard University. After earning his doctorate in South Asian languages and civilizations at the University of Chicago, he taught at Boston College for 21 years before coming to Harvard in 2005. His primary areas of Indological scholarship are theological commentarial writings in the Sanskrit and Tamil traditions of the Hindu India. He's also a leading figure globally in the developing field of comparative theology, a discipline distinguished by attentiveness to the dynamics of theological learning, deepened through the study of traditions other than one's own. He has a pile of publications that you can look at too. But one of the people on here, and sorry if to embarrass you, Jeff, but my friend and colleague in Oman, when I sent him out this note yesterday, he works at the El Amana Center in Oman. He said, "I love Francis Clooney." So here he is. I don't know if it's like 11 p.m. where Jeff is, but man, people will show up from all over the world because truly, Dr. Clooney, you have had a global reach. So welcome today to the University of Calgary, to the Faith and Spirituality Center, to this conversation. And I think the general shape of it is we will hand it over to Dr. Clooney, make sure that he has capacity to share his screen. I don't know if Sarah, if you can do that. I think I saw a nod there. And then when Dr. Clooney, when you're done, if you would like me to handle questions, I can. We were going to talk about this in the first 10 minutes when things weren't working for me. But if you'd like to just receive questions from the community, you're welcome to do that too. Anyway, welcome everybody. So glad you're here. This will be fun. Dr. Clooney, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you, Paul. Thank you for this invitation to meet with such an interesting group. I've been looking forward to this session as I did to the previous two, and know that we can have a good discussion. I presume that you all are very familiar with interfaith work and have interfaith commitments, which I hope in our discussion will come forth, and that not me simply as maybe a catalyst or a resource person, obviously, for the day, but also asking or speaking in a way that you can share your wisdom and your experience as well in the time that we have. So I'll try to be fairly succinct in my presentation, which has to do with my teaching, and then open it up for the discussion as Paul indicated. Again, I express my gratitude to the university and to Marika and Carolyn and Tinu and Paul and others for this invitation to be with you for these lectures. And I do have many rain dates and promises that I can come to Calgary some other time. So I hope all of that works out in the long run. So what I'd like to do is give a little bit of a lead up and then talk about specifically about two of the courses that I've been teaching this year. One course simply called Who Needs God? God, learning about who needs God, the God question in Hindu and Christian tradition. And then of course this semester, Krishna and Christ, Does It Matter? And that's deliberately an ambiguous title. But I'd like to lead in by saying a few things first. The first thing I would say is that this event is really in continuity with the event on Sunday, the lecture, and then the meeting with faculty and grad students yesterday, in the sense that for the last 50 years or so, my work has been interreligious in the sense of close connections between my own Roman Catholic tradition and the Hindu traditions that I study. So I am a Jesuit in a Catholic order, the Society of Jesus. I'm a Catholic priest. And these commitments are important to me. I have a parish call on Sunday. I go and say Mass in the parish regularly. Been in the same parish for almost 24 years now. So it's a long-term commitment in one place. But almost as long, since the early 70s, I've been studying Hinduism. After college, I went to India and then to Nepal, Kathmandu for a 2-year stay teaching high school, and became kind of really enchanted by what I could learn from Buddhism, but particularly from Hinduism. And after ordination in 1978, I did my PhD studies at University of Chicago in the South Asia department, spent more time in India, reading Sanskrit and Tamil texts and so on, and kind of learning back and forth. So all of this is kind of part of who I am. And then my field of work, we all end up writing and lecturing in different ways. But at the core of my work is try to do comparative work where my writing always deliberately crosses the boundary between the Christian and Hindu traditions back and forth. So not simply a Christian absorption of the Hindu, but rather a true engagement, an encounter where there's learning, hopefully on both sides, where vulnerability and without any effort to erase the other or merely convert the other, but a true kind of engagement has been at the core of my work. So naturally, this will overflow into my time in the classroom. Another thing I would say, historically retrospective, that I've been teaching at the college and university level since 1984. So it's adding up. It's becoming a long time. Time flies by. And I would notice, that I was teaching in major, various places, but two main contexts. One, Boston College as a major Catholic university in the United States, about 9,500 undergrads, 14,000 students altogether, including a law school, business school, and so on like that. A PhD program in theology, a PhD program in philosophy, and so on like that. And I think when I got there in the 1980s, 84, it was still, although it was never, in my experience, it was never 100% Catholic. It was predominantly Catholic, and the student body and the faculty and the staff were largely of Catholic tradition. And when I was in the classroom, I could presume Catholic background and assume that the students either were church-going or came from church-going families and at least knew about the Catholic tradition. Occasionally, a Muslim student or a Hindu student or Buddhist student would come into my class, but that was more the exception than the rule in those early days of my teaching. And the problem I had, or the challenge before me as a young professor at Boston College, was to argue that in a Catholic theology department, the study of and learning from other religious traditions was important and valid and something we needed to do. And making the case that Catholic theology is not tainted or somehow lessened by interfaith engagement, but actually it's enhanced. And this is part of how we are and who we are in our learning, is to learn in an interfaith fashion. When after 21 years at BC, I switched over to Harvard, the divinity school, the context was very different. First of all, 20-some years had passed and BC was becoming more cosmopolitan, more complex interreligiously over the decades, certainly, although still Catholic. But Harvard, a 200-year-old institution, the divinity school, in a 400-year-old university or college, the divinity school has always been kind of a non-denominational, as it calls itself, or undenominational divinity school, kind of low church Protestant congregationalist. I'm not an expert on the history, but nonetheless, a sense of local community, practice over doctrine, engagement on the local level without a heavy emphasis on doctrine, creeds, or hierarchy, and so on. And I think by the time I came to Harvard in 2005, that was very advanced, so that before I got there, they more or less the attitude of the school was, we are no longer a Christian divinity school. We are an interfaith divinity school, and trying to mark off the ground by saying people of all faiths are welcome at Harvard Divinity School, and including Roman Catholics, including Orthodox Jews and Muslims of faith, and people of different traditions, or people who are Unitarian Universalists, or people who were seekers. There's a strong humanist movement at Harvard, kind of spiritual but not religious in any sense, groups around the campus. And I found that at Harvard over the years, my, I guess, 16 years now or so at Harvard, having to make the case not that the interfaith mattered, but that the theology mattered, and that theology still mattered and had a role, and that truth, encounter with God, faith, worship had some kind of solidity to it, and learning from tradition was actually something we still needed to do. So the issues and challenges have shifted over the years, but in both contexts, at Harvard and then previously at BC, I more or less focused my work, and this is something you should know for the sake of our conversation, not on world religions in broad scope or the interfaith world in broad scope, but pretty much Christian and Hindu traditions, and among the Christian, pretty much Roman Catholic and certain Hindu traditions with which I was familiar, particularly the Vedanta traditions, Shankara, Ramanuja, great teachers of the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita and so on. And then the Tamil Vaishnava tradition, indigenous tradition, very old of South India, where Vishnu or Narayana with the goddess Sri Lakshmi are the supreme deities. A small but vibrant tradition that today is still very robust in Tamil Nadu and also in the West, temples in North America and everywhere around us. So I've not been a generalist, but I've been very focused. I always tell students taking my courses that we're doing certain kinds of Christian Hindu engagement in my courses. If you are from a different Christian background than I am, you are welcome. If you have different interests in Hinduism, you're welcome. If you're interested in Buddhism and Islam or Chinese religions in East Asia, think of the methodology we use in class and see how that might, what I'm doing in class, how that might open doors for what you want to do in the long run. So while my work is fairly specific, I try to keep it also open to other possibilities and how people think about their work around me. And being at Harvard after BC has been a learning experience for me. As I mentioned, nowadays at Harvard, very multi-faith, but also very spiritual, but not religious. There are many, many exceptions, and there are people with strong church denominational connections or Buddhist commitments or Muslim commitments. But I find many of our students are seekers in the divinity school. Many of them have roots in one or another tradition, but that's up for grabs. They're looking for a local tradition to which they can belong. And they're sort of designing their own compromises and combinations of different traditions so that they can pass over from one to the other and draw on them selectively in a way that is personally authentic and personally meaningful. For many of our students, theology is far less important than ethics, at least in the general sense that your moral commitment, your justice, your work for the equal dignity for all, to have an inclusive community, an anti-hierarchical community, is really what matters. And that how that fits in with believing or not believing in God, or having certain doctrines about this life or a next life, salvation or damnation, is all fine and good as long as you are personal about what you believe and don't try to impose it on others. And so I think there's a very kind of pragmatic, embodied, material kind of commitment. Religion is to be lived. What you think about it is ancillary and secondary to that. And this is very different from growing up Catholic, where we certainly have practice and we certainly have concern about ethical issues, but there's also a strong doctrinal sense of God and so on. But that would be part of where we are at a place like Harvard. Another factor I think that I mentioned already is that a lot of my work, both academically in terms of research, but also teaching, as you'll see with the 2 syllabi in a moment, is text-based, reading great text in translation, classic text ranging from scriptures such as the Bible, Hebrew Bible, New Testament, the Bhagavad Gita, the Upanishads, the Ramayana, the Bhagavatam, the stories of Krishna, Tamil classics in translation and so on like that, occasionally dipping into other traditions with surahs from the Quran, or occasionally a Buddhist text and so on like that, but pretty textual. And for me, that has never meant only textual, as if the books somehow have a floating reality that surpasses lived religion. But for me, it's always mediated through the word. Whereas many of the students are saying, why are we always reading text when we should be concerned about living religion? If most of the people who practice the religions we're talking about don't sit around reading Thomas Aquinas or Shankara or the Upanishads or the Rig Veda or the Hebrew Bible, why are we doing that when we should be talking to, doing ethnographic work and field work and talking to people about what they do? And I admire, people who do field work and ethnographic work, and have no objection to students who care about doing religion differently. But I try to make it clear that's not what I do. And then if I tried to be a different professor, I would probably do it poorly. And so I try to keep my, my eyes open about how to locate the text in the world. We talked about this a little bit the other day about bringing classics to life in the 21st century. But nonetheless, my approach is classical. And that's a lead up to just, again, reminding us that I realize people on the screen here may have other approaches to interfaith and to the learning religions. And that's something we can talk about, because I don't want a monopoly on, the way I do it is the only way to do things. I find that students are also, as I mentioned, not only spiritual, but not religious in many cases, but they're also asking, either innocently or sincerely or with great intensity, is what we're studying in class helpful to me spiritually? And what does it mean for me? And I think it's a divinity school, so maybe there's no surprise in that fact that students who choose to be in a divinity school have those kinds of personal commitments. But people are candid about their faith journeys, where they're going spiritually, and asking, the readings we do in class, ranging from classic texts to, as I did last semester, parts of Gandhi's autobiography, Thomas Merton's 7-Story Mountain, and Lives of Saints and so on. Is this going to help me on my path? And part of it with students is honoring their sincerity and the great depth of their personal commitments as young people, but also trying to say, but there's a certain kind of objectivity or ability need to be able to step outside your personal concerns and commitments of the day and learn from traditions that are far older than any of us. And that tension is important. And the students are also interested, as a corollary to that, who are you, teacher? Who are you, professor? And I think, as in any institution, I'm sure this is true in Calgary too, at Harvard and Harvard Divinity School, some professors are very personal and candid about their own beliefs and practices, and others are hands-off. And it's not really germane to the course to talk about myself or personal commitments. I find it useful, not to be very personal, but to make it clear at the start who I am: Roman Catholic, Catholic priest, a Jesuit, all these years studying Hinduism, to situate it and say, I'm not kind of a neutral, universal viewpoint, but I too have a perspective. If you students in the class don't have the same background as I do, and they never do anymore, what is your background? What is your perspective that you bring into the classroom? What are the questions you bring to reading the text before us? And so it's a certain kind of interfaith dialogical element in the course right from the start, because I think students appreciate the personal element today. So this brings me to the two syllabi, and I'll just show you parts of the two syllabi and then can open it and go for discussion. But I think you can see now that I don't ambition being the ideal teacher for all Harvard Divinity School students or teaching the course that everyone wants to take. I always get a good number of students, but I'm not the most heavily populated classrooms. And I'm not saying that I'm the typical Harvard Divinity School teacher and that most of us do the same thing, but this is what I do, and it works well for the students who take the courses. And again, it's text-based. I used to teach a course called God, Hindu, and Christian. And it was kind of a theological course dealing with kind of classical Hindu views of God and classical Christian views of God with philosophical grounding. I did a book about 20 years ago called Hindu God, Christian God. And the themes in the course were somewhat like the themes in the book: the existence of God, the identity of God, God in the world, and then the problem of revelation. And I was pretty much heavy duty theology back and forth. But over the years, I've felt that students, although I feel strongly that learning theology is a good idea, students were not really learning so well from simply suddenly reading an article of the Summa Theologiae of Aquinas, or suddenly reading something of Shankara's commentary on the Upanishad, but rather how to rework the course more existentially. And the first course of the two that I'll show you, simply because these are the ones I'm teaching this semester, is this course called Who Needs God? Rethinking God in Light of Hindu and Christian Wisdom. So I hope you can see it on the screen, the syllabus. And anyone who wants the syllabus, I can send to you afterwards. I can give it to, I think actually Paul, I think, has it, but we can make it available to people who talk to Paul if you want to look at it more closely. And so the title, which I came up with, I think about a year ago, we're in the pandemic, we're facing existential questions, there are crises all around us. Who needs God, as a twist on the question of God, Hindu, and Christian, or thinking about God interreligiously, to take up the topic of God and to look at it carefully, using again, as I do, my Hindu and Christian examples. The description of the course was pretty basic. Reflects on God, the idea, the reality, the significance in light of Hindu and Christian scriptures, from philosophical and theological perspectives with reference to spiritual paths to union with God, all reread in light of modern theological questions and doubts about the very idea of God, in a culture where belief in God and even understanding of God is waning. We can no longer take for granted like a basic theological vocabulary. The questions of the course, I hoped, were modern, at least for me, but dedicated to going back and using traditional sources to look at our world in the 21st century in light of the tradition. So going to the past to shed new light on the present. Knowing both Hindu and Christian traditions on God clarifies each tradition as we learn from their great similarities and great differences. So how might studying God comparatively change our God talk, God practice, God love, here and now? And I promise, because we were deep into the pandemic, a quiet course for noisy times. One thing I'd say before just skimming the readings of the course was that I find it useful, and I'm sure again many of you have found the same thing. If I was to teach a course simply on the Christian understanding of God or the Roman Catholic understanding of God, there might be a certain limit to who would be interested, and a certain kind of either pious acceptance or stubborn resistance to kind of getting the doctrine. Doing it interfaith, I just do it with two courses, but you could do it obviously with more, makes all the traditions vulnerable to one another, kind of decenters them and opens up the possibility of a different kind of learning. And I think that strategically works, that we're not just saying, I'm now gonna make you learn Thomas Aquinas, but we can read Aquinas a bit and read Shankara or Ramanuja a bit, great Hindu thinkers. We can talk about Christian sacraments. We can talk about Hindu temple worship. And that seems to create a more lively learning possibility where the alternatives are visible in the classroom. So just to give you a sense where we went with the course, and then I'll tell you briefly about the other, began with a set of readings back in September of 2020. Readings I'd found largely on the web or things I knew. Derek Thompson, 3 decades ago, America Lost Its Religion. Why? An article from The Atlantic. Millennials and God, Nicolette Manglos-Weber, The Millennials' God, Generation Z on God. Crystal Manning, Generation Z is the least religious generation. Here's why that could be a good thing. Reed Lachlan, some of you may know him, he teaches at St. Michael's in Toronto. Constructing Boundaries by Crossing Them, Contemporary Comparative Theology as a Practice of Community Self-Definition. John Gray, defending and sorting out kinds of atheism, not assuming that we know what atheism is. And then slipping in one fairly heavy-duty piece by Wolfhard Pannenberg, the German theologian, The Concept of God and the Question of Truth. Jeffrey Koski, The Birth of Modern Philosophy of Religion, the Death of Transcendence. And we alluded in this part of the course also to Charles Taylor's work on the disenchantment of the world and so on. And then we went through, and I will not go through all of this because it would take too long, but the highlighted titles, who is the God we don't need, we do or don't need anymore, back to the scriptures to look at some understandings of God, representations of God, which, as you know, are invariably more complicated and more interesting than any kind of flat notion. This is what the Jews believe, this is what the Christians believe, this is what the Hindus believe. But great texts are confusing and open things up. I use another Canadian here as background, Klaus Klostermaier, a great scholar of Hinduism, I think up in Edmonton, maybe. I forget exactly where at this point. So we went through some scriptures just to liven things up, and students even of the traditions may not have read these texts. And then looking deeper, kind of investing in 2 texts, Encountering the Divine Person by Intellectual Spiritual Journey. St. Bonaventure of the Catholic tradition, this wonderful text, The Journey of the Soul into God, the Itinerarium, Mentis ad Deum. Basically a 7-chapter kind of masterpiece of finding God through the world, finding God through the self, finding God beyond the self. And then comparing it and reading it with the Soundarya Lahari, The Ocean or Wave of Beauty, a medieval Hindu text that I had worked on in a book almost 20 years ago, in which there's a kind of theology of the goddess followed by a full-scale 40-verse meditation on the goddess head to foot that brings you into the presence of the goddess. And the point was that these are theological texts that are performative, and they draw you into the doing of something, and they try to engage you, teach you theology, but also pull you to see the world differently, to understand yourself differently, and to learn. Then looking to the 19th century, because any course like this you skip badly, looking at 2 19th century saints who intensely needed God, who had no problem of God, but their problem was they couldn't get enough of God, or they had so much of God it was changing their lives. So Sri Ramakrishna, the 19th century Hindu mystic, goddess worshiper, Kali worshiper, instinctive, intuitive understanding of God, and yet practice different pathways, sadhanas of Tantra, Vedanta, devotionalism to Krishna, and so on like that. What is it about a saint that the saint needs God so much? Comparing him and contrasting with Thérèse of Lisieux, a 19th century French Catholic nun who died young at only age 25. But basically in her short life, in her Story of a Soul, the intensity of her longing for God and identification with God, as basically saying 2 life stories can begin to teach us something about what knowledge of God is like, or why people care about God. I prefaced it because we had read earlier in the course in John Gray's talk about atheism. We turned to Dostoevsky, the brothers Karamazov. The famous chapters were Ivan the older brother, and Alyosha, talk about the Grand Inquisitor, talk about cruelty in the world, Alyosha's finding of God, this kind of existential atheism as a necessity in an unjust world. And then Alyosha kind of rediscovering its harmony with the universe, trying to bring the imaginative frame of literature to bear before reading the Ramakrishna and the Thérèse of Lisieux. And then the final part of the course, reimagining the search in the 20th century. And there's so many figures that could come in here, but I use parts of Gandhi's Story of My Experiments with Truth and parts of Thomas Merton's Seven-Story Mountain, his great monastic journey in mid-20th century America. And I think I'll introduce briefly the other one, and then we can talk about both. But I would say regarding this course, I think it worked fairly well in the sense that there was enough variety in the readings, enough kind of diversity of possibilities that it awakened all kinds of questions and concerns for students. I would think in a course like this, every student comes away with some kind of different takeaway. Because I didn't have a single thing except to take tradition seriously, except to problematize both belief and unbelief, because we may not know what we're talking about, and open things up, seemed to be working with the students. They wrote great papers and so on. There are about 27 students, I think, in the class. I think it worked fairly well. And I think, the best students in the class, those who had scholarly instincts, realized we were like touching on the top point of 1,000 icebergs, that there's far more to do on each of these topics than the little bit we were doing, and giant worlds of learning were being opened. More briefly, I'll do it similar, but the other course this semester, Krishna and Christ, is again a course I taught once several years ago and decided to do again this semester. I added the subtitle, Does It Matter? Because I'm aware, again, at Harvard Divinity School that there are ways in which this can seem like an archaic theme. In the 19th century and earlier, there were missionary controversies with Hindu pundits and so on about Krishna and Christ. There were competitions. There were theories that Christ was derived from the Krishna stories, that Krishna was derived from the Christ stories, or that in fact, the two words are actually the same word. They're just two spellings of the same word that became historically differentiated. But does it matter? Or is this like things people used to fight about and argue about that no one actually fights about anymore? Because if you believe in Krishna, that's nice. If you believe in Christ, that's nice. If you don't believe in either of them, that's nice. If you have in your room images of Christ and Krishna, well, that's nice too. Where does it matter, and how does it matter to think about these things? I try to make the course visual. These are pretty obvious visual images of the child Krishna, the child Christ, and then the grown-up teachers and so on. But to do this course well, and I'll just run through this again fairly quickly, the same kind of principle of reading text. The first 3 classes, which are just a warm-up when students are still shopping around and getting used to the semester, were historical perspectives. And the historical perspectives were back to the time when these things clearly mattered. So to 19th, 18th century debates about Christ and Krishna, reading 19th century documents in English. So missionary figures like Charles Hardwick, L.A. Sakes, who really robustly wanted to solve the problem of who Christ is, who Krishna is, and show really that Christ is the answer India has been looking for. Figures like Keshav Chandra Sen, Swami Vivekananda, reimagining Hindu tradition, Hindu philosophy and theology, kind of a universality to the Hindu tradition, which could include Jesus Christ. And Jesus is fine, Jesus can be part of our Hindu wisdom, but we're not going to become Christians. It's separate to what we think of the church, what we think of the British who claim to be Christian, and how we receive and think about Jesus. So getting into some of these 19th century debates, Dayananda Saraswati, the 19th century Dayananda, in his book, The Light of Truth, Satyarth Prakash, is fairly witheringly critical of anything he considered to be mythology. And he was withering about Avatar, withering about incarnation, and basically saying we have to get rid of the trappings of piety and have kind of a true rational Vedantic religion. So throwing him in there too, Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay, defending Krishna from a Hindu perspective, writing in Bengali, but writing in English as well. And in the United States, Paramahamsa Yogananda, who had come to the US in 1920, so 100 years ago, he writes this fabulous book, if you've ever seen it, The Second Coming of Christ, about 1,000 pages of commentary on the Gospels. And I gave them some sections of that, including the opening where Yogananda says, I'm going to read and understand the Gospels. And when I come to a part I do not understand, I will pray and Jesus will appear to me and he will explain the difficulties. So a kind of mystical relationship. And Kenneth Rose, writing about his journey in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and so on, how he went from being a Roman Catholic in Brooklyn, where I was born as a Roman Catholic in Brooklyn, to being a Hare Krishna, an evangelical Protestant, back to Hare Krishna, and then becoming kind of a non-dualist. And the journey of somebody in the 20th century to Christ and Krishna back and forth. Then we plunge into the text and we read childhood stories of Christ and Krishna using the famous Bhagavata Purana, classic of Sanskrit literature, but popular in Bengal, of the birth and the childhood of Krishna, some of those charming stories of the child and so on, along with not only the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of Matthew, the Christmas stories, but also this text known as the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, which fills in the years from 5 to 12 in the life of Jesus. And it's extra canonical, it's not in the New Testament, but has fascinating and sometimes problematic stories about the child Jesus. But in both cases, you see representations of childhood, representations of little boys and then young men, and how they negotiate being divine figures and how people relate to them. And so opening that up, a couple of classes on the cosmic Christ and cosmic Krishna, that these figures are not simply figures in the world, but the entire universe is in Krishna. He is the creator of the universe. It grows out of him. The gods come from him and they worship him. And to realize who Krishna is, the little boy, you're also realizing the very meaning of the universe. Similarly, Colossians and other passages could have been taking. I give Yaroslav Pelikan's chapter, The Cosmic Christ, in the background. But the Jesus of Nazareth, the Jesus who died on the cross, is also the Lord in whom the universe was made. So, go small, go large. We just finished a section of the course, because it's an actual ongoing course, on Jesus, Christ, and Krishna as teachers and role models. Do what I say and maybe do what I do. And trying to get into issues of ethics, like what actually do you do if you are a follower of Christ? What actually do you do if you follow the Sermon on the Mount? What do you do if you follow Bhagavad Gita, particularly the Karma Yoga of chapters 3, 4, and 5 is the section we looked at closely. What does it mean to follow and live according to their example? And can we say, trying to raise evaluative questions in a non-threatening way, can we say that one way of living is more pertinent and needed in the 21st century than the other way? And we almost never come to that conclusion that one is better, abstractly than the other. But what would it be like to live like the Krishna of the Gita or like the Christ of the Sermon on the Mount? And then getting into the radical witness, the other, not the Sermon on the Mount, but passage of what Jesus says again and again, take up your cross and follow me. Leave everything behind and come to me. Lose yourself to find yourself. Turn the other cheek. Do not resist evil. Kind of the radical Christ who's harder to imitate, using some Kierkegaard along the way. And then quite different, but nonetheless radical, the Rasa Leela dance, the many pictures you see of Christ dancing with the gopis, the cowherd girls, which is basically erotic dancing, loving Krishna, intensely loving Krishna, entering into this intimate relation with Krishna. And there we had to look at it from two angles. How literally do you take this? Do you try to become one of the cowherd women? And sometimes not so much now, but in the past we saw Hare Krishnas dancing on street corners with the invisible Krishna. How literal is that to be taken? But also, how much should one imitate the Krishna who seems to have the freedom to relate to everybody as the beloved? Is there ethical norms there about self and other that Krishna raises that are different from the ones that Jesus raises? So that kind of ethical thinking. Briefly, and then I'll stop. The upcoming parts of the course, we're on spring break this week, loving Christ, loving Krishna in mystical poetry. So on the Hindu side, we have, there's a mistake there, I'll have to correct it, but Andal was a 9th century Tamil poet from South India, who she basically adopted a kind of bridal mysticism, imagining, loving Krishna, yearning for Krishna, marrying Krishna, suffering in separation from Krishna. So we'll read 4 of her 10-verse songs with some attention to commentary. And then finding a parallel is always hard. But this year, for the first time, I've settled on Gertrude of Helftha, one of the medieval mystic women who has a very strong Christ focus. So not simply a God focused or the Godhead focused, but in her Herald of Divine Love, book 2, which is the part she actually wrote, it's almost like a liturgical diary of all the occasions in church at communion, in her prayer, when she has this intimate relationship with Jesus, which transforms her, tests her, purifies her. At one point, Jesus takes her hand and puts it into his side that has been pierced, and her hand comes out wearing a wedding ring. And there are all these kind of mystical, what do we do with mystical poetry in the 2 traditions in the 21st century? Quite different from the ethical issues, but nonetheless raising questions. And most of the month of April, we will be dealing with a theological problem, avatar and incarnation. And this is sort of another version of the does it matter question. So in the 19th century, 20th century, many Christian theologians have said, no, avatara, where God descends into the world many times, the 10 avatars of Vishnu and all that, totally different from incarnation. They're only seeming presences. There are many of them. They don't change everything radically. The incarnation is once for all and totally different. Is that the case? How has it been talked about historically? And then, does it matter? Do we still care about questions like the difference between avatara and incarnation? And we do a range of things from the 20th century, 19th century, and recent theology. We also go back, reading the Gospel of John, to Hildegard of Bingen, another medieval theologian, and Thomas Aquinas, both of them, their comments on the Gospel of John, chapter 1. Ramanuja, the great Hindu theologian, on Gita 4, where he talks about avatars and so on. And then the course will end, and they'll write papers, and we'll see what comes out of it. But kind of introducing theology, introducing comparative work, pushing back and forth between the 2 traditions, and doing that in both courses. So I've said a lot, maybe in 40 minutes or so, and I could talk about other courses too, but I think you get the idea of the kind of work that I do, having one role on campus in terms of interfaith, not saying this is the only interfaith thing to be done, or this is the only way to do it, but this is the way I do it. And it, for some students it works wonderfully, and some students it maybe doesn't work for, but nonetheless, that's what I do. Thank you all for listening, and we can now talk about it.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Clooney. First of all, thanks for showing up on your spring break, right?
Oh, sure.
And secondly, one of the things that may be asked is, so if I can't get into Harvard, how do I still get to take some of these courses? But with those 2 questions, we can put those on the side for now and maybe see what other questions come from the people. And people, I think, is it okay, Dr. Clooney, if they just unmute and ask their question? Yeah,
I think I don't think I can see everybody. There's to be some over to a second screen. If people could use their electronic hands, I mean, if you're on the screen I'm looking at, you can wave your hand, but for others, maybe the electronic hand, because otherwise you get lost in the other screen. So I think Charles Podia looks like Jesuit father. Okay, Father Charles.
You need to unmute.
Unmute.
Father Charles. Let me see if I can request that you do that.
Got it. Sorry. Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. We had met briefly somewhere in the past.
Okay.
And so my question simply is about Tagore, the great Bengali poet, and his, I think it's Gitanjali.
Gitanjali, yes.
Yeah. And his religious poems, which I am very attracted to. I spent a year in India, and anyway, I just wondering do you use him at all in your teaching? What do you think of him?
Yeah, I think when I got to grad school in Chicago, I had to pick a second language to learn after Sanskrit, and I was being urged to pick up Tamil as my second language, which I did, of South India, but I was tempted to take Bengali just so I could read Tagore in the original, and to get a feel for Tagore, because his poetry is so beautiful in English, particularly this little book. I mentioned this on Sunday. It was like the first Hindu text I connected with, was reading Gitanjali in Kathmandu in 1973, and this book of kind of mystical clarity and depth that it's a prayer book, and I can go back to it any number of times. So I think highly of that book. And as I mentioned, William Butler Yeats wrote a wonderful introduction to it that is still also worth reading. I learned over the years, though, that Tagore was, one of these universal geniuses. He wrote novels, he wrote plays, he wrote essays, he founded Shanti Niketan, the school. And he sort of had a very big public profile in early mid 20th century India, not as famous as Gandhi in certain circles, but as an educator, poet, dramatist, and celebrator of Bengali culture. Wonderful. But at the heart of it was the part maybe that both of us would love, that this kind of intimate, simple, mystical poetry that speaks across traditional boundaries. And the version that won the Nobel Prize is the one that Yeats wrote the introduction for. Scholars of Bengali have translated the Bengali Gitanjali into English, which is another text which has some of the English in it and some other things in it. It comes across quite different parts of it. It's a different feel to it, but the English book is wonderful, and I often go back to that. And I don't use it in class too much for some reason. I think because there are all these little poems, and I look for longer kind of narrative pieces or collected pieces, but I sneak them in once in a while.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Mirka Hall Fire.
Thank you. I'm speaking from a context here of no longer being an academic. I have retired. And when I was an academic at U of C, I was not in the field of theology or religious studies. However, I'm through church commitments, but also because I am, I suppose, by nature a scholar. I find that the most difficult interfaith, as it were, dialogue that I have to engage in an active way is with Indigenous spirituality. And I find that if I'm looking for traditional models of how this might be done, I look more at the pre-Patrick Celtic church and how the dialogue between that and the Roman tradition represented by Patrick went on. But even there, we have ancient texts which we're dealing with, which allows a certain externalizing, if you will, of the questions that are being asked. Even listening directly to people coming from an Indigenous tradition. I don't know how to define the questions, I guess, because we don't seem to have common stories or common texts that one can go to and externalize so that it doesn't become an argument, as it were.
Yeah.
Have any comments on that? Paul,
Yeah.
I don't know if the Faith and Spirituality Center finds that to be a question or would frame it in that way. I'm speaking just for myself here.
Well, I would say a couple of things, and then you could jump back in. But I mean, I think right. So another problem that people sometimes point out about what I do is that if it's so textually based and using the great text of the great tradition in quotation marks, that leaves out a lot. So the Aboriginal traditions of Australia, many of the African traditions, which are oral traditions, and the Native American traditions are often omitted. And people say, well, what about those traditions? You talk about reading the text of two traditions together. Why are you not looking at those other oral traditions and so on? And our divinity school now is just beginning to talk about hiring somebody who does Native American religion, full-time person, but that hasn't happened yet. But then people will also talk about, well, you're reading the learned traditions of India. What about all the local oral folktale traditions and so on? Why don't you work on those? And then, the ancient forms of Christianity that are not in Latin or not in the great text. I mean, partly I just plead inability to do everything and say, God bless you, you should do that, not me, I can't do that. But I think it's a matter of trying to diversify what you can do and bring in new voices. So I mentioned bringing in, Andal, the mystical woman poet of medieval India, Margaret of Helftha, Hildegard of Bingen. So a little bit of diversity, getting out of like the dominant male teacher mode. But nonetheless, it's limited. And I think there are other ways of learning. Sometimes I take advantage of my doctoral students who are my teaching fellows. So last year I had a doctoral student who was in our religion program, but from Cameroon. And he took a segment of the course on like Muslim Christian relations in West Africa. And he talked about pilgrimage practices, pieties, teachers, and so on like that. And he was great. I mean, he's not only came from that part of Africa, but also video clips, interviews, and so on like that, bringing to life how you would engage oral traditions. Now he's no longer my TF, so that moment has gone by. But I appreciate it, but I just don't do it very much myself. But it does, I think, open our eyes to realize that the things we do are always accompanied by the things we don't do, and other traditions dealt with differently. And some people say, like I have a friend who's a Taoist scholar, a scholar of Taoism, in terms of you don't really understand Taoism by reading the Tao Te Ching. You have to understand the Taoist rituals and so on like that, and you have to know the practices more deeply. And so I think there are different ways of opening this up. When I started out, it was pretty much everybody reading their text and then writing about their texts. And for younger, even Christian theologians today, it's more diverse, and maybe it will continue to get more diverse over time.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Question is from Jeffrey Boss, I think, or at least he had his hand up at one point.
I did. I just got so excited when Tagore was mentioned.
Okay.
I spent 15 years in Bangladesh.
Oh.
And part of that was under the tutelage of Father David Burrell, whose tutelage I remain under. And I was involved in a number of scriptural reasoning projects in Bangladesh, and that's what connected me to Paul, because he's been supporting some scriptural reasoning in University of Calgary. And one of the things that strikes me about comparative theology and scriptural reasoning is, there's this criticism that, okay, comparative theology is just, one scholar in a room by the text, but that all changes when you bring it into the classroom. Scriptural reasoning is focused on the community and the return to the text. But my question is the third. And my experience in Bangladesh is Thakur has often provided the third. Even though we were doing scriptural reasoning with Muslim Christians and Hindus, it was this kind of a contemporary, it was Thakur who really helped students, pull this together. So what really intrigued me is in your courses, how you moved and then you went to some moderns. And I think I would call Thakur modern in that sense. But how do you utilize those kind of third texts or more contemporary texts to illuminate the ancient texts? Kind of coming out of that University of Chicago classic text tradition. Yeah.
I mean, so in terms of third text, you mean something other than the main traditions you're studying that is a catalyst or changes the way you read the main ones? Is that when you say third text? Yeah. Okay. I mean, I think partly what I think is that the traditions let's say the materials I put up on the screen are not homogeneous in the sense that they're all kind of monolithically, all marching in step. This is the Christian, this is the Hindu. They're actually all over the place in terms of what's going on. So you can do a Vedantic text, you can do a goddess text, you can do Ramakrishna, you can do Gandhi. And similarly, you're reading Therese of Lisieux, you're reading Bonaventure, you're reading biblical text. These things are all catalysts changing the way one reads the other. But I think poetry in general is extremely helpful. So we just did the dance of Krishna, the Rasa Leela, which is very popular in Bengal. It's the Vaishnava, Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition in Bengal. And the Graham Schwag, American scholar, has done a lovely verse translation of the chapters that are relevant. We had looked in class at another prose translation of the same verses. And the poetry translation was far more evocative in opening things up. And I think at least turning to poetry, and then with somebody like Tagore, as I did once many years ago, I think with the help of a grad student, playing the Bengali of some of his songs, in Bangla being sung out loud, and the rhythm and the power of them can change the dynamic. So it's a complicated issue of bringing things to life in the classroom. I tried, in the course, the Who Needs God course, to go from very ancient texts like the Hebrew Bible and the Rig Veda, those are pretty old, up to 19th century figures like Ramakrishna, who very powerful figure, at the cusp of modernity. His disciple Vivekananda travels to the West and so on like that, along with Thérèse of Lisieux, who's out in a little town outside Paris, but the world is changing quickly around these people. I used Gandhi and Merton because they're both figures who travel, they travel, they live in different parts of the world, they experience reality differently. Merton is good for students because he's at Columbia University in New York when he has his conversion experience and so on. But I mean, just to finish, you mentioned David Burrell, a great man, a great model I've looked up to over the years. When I was, getting started in the work I do, I looked with admiration to his work. He, a well-known Holy Cross father at Notre Dame, a scholar of Aquinas, but for the sake of reading Aquinas properly, I realized that Aquinas is always talking to Arab thinkers and Jewish thinkers like Maimonides. And therefore he got into learning Arabic. He went to Cairo, he learned Arabic and began to write books crossing the boundaries simply to do Aquinas better. And that's an example of both creativity and boldness in middle age to learn Arabic and do your work differently. I don't know if that helps enough, but Tagore is sort of lingering there, but how to use Tagore in my classrooms has always been a question.
One of the things that always fascinated me in Bangladesh is whether you're Muslim, Hindu, or Christian, you will sing Tagore.
Okay.
And even in worship services, the Catholic hymnal in Bangla contains Tagore songs.
Okay. Yeah, and that's, I don't know if you noticed, and the ability to be a Tagore and to write in a way that everybody can recognizes their proud culture and who we are is wonderful. I mentioned the text of Brahma Samhita, which is not so well known, about all the universe created in Krishna, but I give them a song that George Harrison, one of the Beatles, wrote based on verses from the Brahma Samhita. And students, whether they were Hindu or Christian or neither or none, loved listening to George Harrison. It's a very catchy rhythmic song. If we have time, I guess I could put it on and play it for you if you wanted. But there's George Harrison. He's no Rabindranath Tagore, but nonetheless had the genius to be able to get in everybody's head, and you keep hearing his music. And that helped bring the Hindu text to life, because Harrison had a Krishna connection for part of his life.
I haven't seen another question kind of with the hand raised, but my guess is there are still some out there. Oh, Kelly.
Hi, yeah, I didn't know how to virtually oh, there it is, sorry. Well, thank you so much. I've been learning a lot from your talk, so I really appreciate everything that you've shared. I was hoping that you could talk a little bit more about the spiritual but not religious category and how that sort of plays out at Harvard. I understand that Harvard has a humanist chaplain, and Chris Stedford wrote Faithiest. So I'm curious about the spiritual but not religious category and how atheists or humanists fit into interfaith work. And I'm curious a little bit. I think there's, I mean, to use Chris Stedman as an example, I mean, he certainly sees that atheists have a role to play in interfaith work. But I mean, I personally know a lot of atheists or humanists who wouldn't even consider interreligious dialogue or interfaith work to be even something that they would be a part of. And so I'm curious if you have any insight on kind of how to integrate that, and yeah, more words about this would be appreciated.
Yeah, and others on the screen, I'm sure have thought about this a lot, and they want to jump in with their ideas. I mean, I would say two things. I mean, one would be the general category of spiritual but not religious. I think for Generation Z, Generation X, for millennials, increasingly the freedom or the loss of freedom from loss of tradition in terms of being spiritual by being religious. And so, you know, my generation, growing up Irish Catholic in New York City, you found your spiritual grounding by going to church, and you found it through Lent and through Easter and pieties of the Catholic Church. You might rebel against it at some point and throw it over, but it was always going to be there kind of lurking in your life, that if you were going to do this, there were certain ways that we do it. You know, my parents, my grandparents, my ancestors did it. And I find for many younger people today, you know, as I said, their baby boomer parents were all over the place, and there's a certain kind of uncertainty. But the high price on individual authenticity and integrity makes it a sense of what matters is not, paying obeisance to a tradition or submitting myself to its doctrines or having a membership, but doing my own artful, earnest search and finding meaning, with the ability to keep switching. So we have a noon service at Harvard Divinity School on Wednesdays, which goes back to the old, I think, Harvard Divinity School Protestant tradition of a chapel service, you know, every day and then just on Wednesdays. But every week it's taken up by a different faith community in the school. So one week the Catholics, one week the Parsis, another week the Orthodox Jews, and other weeks the Gay Lesbian Coalition. The Humanists do a week, and then the Hindus do a week. And some people participate joyfully in all of them. And I think the main thing is building community, being together, worshiping together. And if this week we're being asked to receive ashes on Ash Wednesday because the Catholics are running it, another week, here is the image of Kali set up, and we'll come up and touch the feet of Kali and receive kumkum, the tika on our foreheads. Well, that's what we do that week. And people like me find it harder to do that exactly. But for a lot of younger people, it's the authenticity that counts. But the other part of it is if you snap the link between religion and spirituality, then it's an easier pathway from spirituality to humanism, atheism as a kind of spiritual path. That it's not doctrinal issues, do you believe in God or not, that are dividing, but are you a good person? Are you sincere? Do you care about your neighbor, and so on like that? So Greg Epstein with the Humanist Society at Harvard, he's one of the Harvard chaplains. And he always uses occasions to remind people that religious language always has to be complemented by spiritual language, and talking about the churches and so on has to be, humanists and atheists are good people too, and therefore you can't leave us out of the conversation and so on like that. All of that, I think, comes into play. One way I handled it in this course, I had reviewed the book by John Gray, a well-known British atheist, I gather, and very popular writer. There's a book like the seven kinds or seven types of atheism. And he goes through a whole range of, it's a very nice little book. The title, I think I told you the title, but 7 Types of Atheism. And partly what he does, by the time he gets to the end of the book, he's into kind of mystical atheism. He comes to Schopenhauer, and he comes to modern figures who are haunted by the God question and don't have any room for God in their system, but a kind of either a spiritual path of a via negativa that is a kind of atheism that resonates with spirituality. He also thinks he's a very caustic writer. Some atheists are no better off than fundamentalists. that they totally latch onto, and they say stupid things about other people, and they try to be clever, and they're always falling over themselves. So I think thinking of who needs God, even if you don't need God, you're dealing with some of the same questions, comes into play. Does that, Kelly, get at the issues you're thinking of, or maybe I missed something?
No, it does for sure. And I guess the one maybe more existential question that I have about the spiritual but not religious path is this focus on authenticity and individualism, which I mean, certainly speaks to me as, you know, a Gen Y millennial, like, yes, I'm wanting this, but I also I wonder if in pursuing that and you know, really focusing on what speaks to me and how to be, you know, how can I be authentic, that how then do I show up in community, and how do I, you know, how do I build connections with people who think very differently from me? And I think in the spiritual but not religious stream of things, there can be I worry that there might be a breakdown for civil dialogue, and I think that's sort of the spirit of interreligious dialogue is you know, building connection and communication between different traditions and different ways of seeing things. And so I don't know how the humanists and the atheists deal with that. And even, you know, like as you were mentioning with the sort of mystical atheists, it seems that they're sneaking in some of the goods of religion while, you know, kind of holding it at an arm's length. And I don't know. I don't know what to make of it all, really. Yeah.
Yeah, let me say something again. If anyone else has really thought a lot about this or wants to share what they thought, just put your hand up or jump in, because Paul, I'm sure you have things to say. But I mean, I would say that in part, you know, there's residual religiosity in a lot of spiritual but not religious spiritualities, that, you know, the language, the practices, the virtues taken for granted of loving your neighbor, telling the truth, caring for the other, altruism, justice, are much more at home in the religious traditions, and people who are who are throwing off religion but keeping the values and virtues, I think, as you're saying, in some ways are living on borrowed time, that they're still resonating with the practices of their parents and their grandparents, at least the ideals of their parents and grandparents. But I do worry at a place, and I've said this at Harvard, so I'm not talking about them secretly, is we are very concerned at Divinity School about issues of justice and issues of inclusion, issues ranging from divestment in fossil fuels to prison reform, to obviously today issues of racism, racial justice, Black Lives Matter, reforming, you know, our too white educational system, opening up and diversifying our faculty and so on like that, and saying we all have to do this together. But sometimes I wonder if we have any substantive spiritual communion among ourselves to enable us to do it for the long haul. Because it seems that what we have in common, according to some of the rhetoric I hear, is we all care about these issues. And it doesn't matter what you believe, it doesn't matter where you come from, it doesn't matter your worldview, but we all care about these issues. And I think that could either be a profound way of inclusion, or a way of having the right things to say, but without any depth of, you know, possibility of reform and so on. Like, I think unless there's spiritual grounding for a community, it may be hard for the community to really do anything together. And if we deny any kind of doctrinal claims about truth or about goodness or about the way the world really is, do we really have the answer? And the answer, I've said on occasion, is not that we go back and let's pretend it was 1960 or 1920 and be the way we used to be, but rather say, if we're going to be interfaith, spiritual and religious, spiritual but not religious, then we have to work as hard as our ancestors did today about building it and making it into a common conversation. And I think sometimes we're not doing that because we're so individualistic.
Thank you for that question. Thanks for the response. There's a lot on the table there that probably means at some level we'll have to keep walking together to figure it out, right?
Joy has her hand up.
Oh, there's Joy. Oh.
Hi, hello again. Thank you so much, Dr. Clooney. This has been really inspiring, and I really love the way you balance your location in a long tradition, and both academically and religiously situate yourself in that long tradition, and then reach out and try and understand and resonate with another long tradition. And I also really appreciate the emphasis on reading classical texts. And so I have a question kind of taking us back to the syllabi, and wondering, what are some of the strategies you use in the classroom to help your students read those texts? Kelly actually is my TA in a class I'm teaching right now called Chaos, Demons, and Monsters, which is a course title that Tinu, it's his brilliance there, and students really love those themes. And we read some sections of the Bhagavata Purana, and then we read a bit of Genesis. And each of the texts we've read, each text embeds so much, or presumes that the reader knows so many other features of that tradition to understand what's going on in the text. And so our students have really done an admirable job of diving in and trying to understand what they can from those texts. But I wondered if you have, what are some of the strategies you use to help your students engage with texts across traditions when sometimes they don't have all of the cultural references to understand what's going on in that text, because they are coming from maybe without a traditional grounding?
Yeah. First, it sounds like we should all trade syllabi. I'd love to see the syllabus for that course, and I'll give you mine if you give me yours.
I would love to. Thank you so much, Risala, and I'd be very happy to share mine, and I'd welcome your feedback on mine too.
Good, thank you. I mean, I think all of us who have had any experience teaching or religious education or preaching, I mean, we always have the problem of connecting old things and classic things and holy texts and all that to the people in front of us. So most weekends, either live in church, I preach on Sunday, and this past year I've been writing homilies and posting them because the parish has been shut down for a lot of the time. But it's always a question if you have, in those contexts, you have readings from a long ago, and then people sitting in front of you who are looking for nourishment today. It's a strain to say, how do you make the connection? I mean, partly for me, it is both in the pulpit and in the classroom. If I'm bored by this, then it's going to be a disaster in the classroom. I have to be searching my own soul. Like, why would I care about the book of Genesis now? Or why would I care about a hymn from the Rig Veda? Or why would I care about Gandhi or Thomas Merton? I mean, there are these questions of where is the connection? Why did I put these things in the syllabus? So there are points of contact that I try to bring to the fore. I mean, I think strategically what I do in my courses, and I'm sure many of you do the same thing, is emphasize reading, emphasize you got to read these texts, you've got to live with them, you should read them more than once and so on like that. But then in the classroom, try to come up with a few, like at the beginning of class, put a few insights out on the screen or on the table and say, well, look, here are 3 points I come away with from these readings today. So let's take the recent reading I was doing about the Rasa Leela, the dance of Krishna. It's beautiful poetry. Secondly, only in the Song of Songs in the Bible might you find anything in the Bible, even close to the dance of Krishna. But concerns I have is, right in the text itself, it raises the question, isn't Krishna violating norms by dancing with other men's wives? Is it sexist because it's the women who come out and dance and get sweaty and get excited by Krishna and the men stay back home? What about all of that? And what about the, does this have anything to do with the real world piety, real world living? So people are starving to death. There's caste discrimination, there are exclusions in Indian society, and certain people enter this kind of mystical world of piety, loving Krishna, dancing with Krishna. Isn't this irresponsible in a way? Just as a medieval Christian mystic might say, I am now the bride of Christ. and just stay in the monastery all their lives. So trying to raise like different issues about it. And then as I, the whole theme of that section of the course, what does it mean to imitate? And I gave the class an article by David Haberman, Indiana University. It's a classmate of mine in grad school in Chicago. And he says it was actually a debate in 19th century Bengal about what does it mean to be like the cowherd women who dance with Krishna. And there seemed to be a divide between, it's sort of like the, the literal Franciscans and the Franciscans who build institutions. You be exactly like Jesus, you walk like Jesus, you have nothing but the open air to sleep in and all that because you're like Jesus, or you have Christian Franciscan values in a great institution. Likewise, you have deep love of Krishna in your heart and leave it at that. Or you actually, men try to dress up like women and people dance together on the street corners and say you have to live it literally despite the scorn of society and all that, otherwise it doesn't matter. So I think I tried at the beginning of this to throw out some interesting questions and then go from there. Occasionally having to, particularly when students write, steer them back into the readings and saying, this is really interesting what you're talking about, but it has nothing to do with the readings of this course, or you've branched off into something else. But in the classroom, it's a matter of trying to come up with some real questions, real enough that I don't actually have answers to them, and then seeing who picks up on them. And sometimes you're at the mercy of how students are feeling on a certain day, and the class goes slowly, but other days it goes well. I mean, does that make sense, that those kinds of provocations?
Yes, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah, and I put a note in the chat to say, normally we go for 75 minutes actually, so it's around that time. I want to say thank you for everybody for coming. Normally we also have food and we're in some room on the University of Calgary's campus and we still talk for another 35, 45 minutes anyway. And then often some of us go to lunch together. So you are, to the degree that Dr. Clooney is able and willing, you are all welcome to linger. And but before, just to kind of provide a closing moment, let me say thank you to Dr. Clooney. I don't know, we're all figuring out how to do this. Like, look at these reactions we can throw up. There we go. Thank you, Dr. Clooney.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming. I think this was your third of the 3 Craigie lecture conversations. And so I'll just quick pass it over to Marika, who maybe will also say something about the larger frame.
I just would like to add my thanks, and this has been these have been remarkable talks, and I will ask you all to hold me to getting you here in person so that we can talk about this further. There were so many things that came up this morning, and my own work in teaching Christian Muslim dialogue in the 8th century, that I love the idea of making religions vulnerable to one another, and even doing that in the past. So I am so grateful for this talk. And so on behalf of the Department of Classics and Religion and the Faculty of Arts who helped sponsor this lecture, on behalf of the over 100 people you've spoken to in the last few days, I just would like to add my thanks and say this has been really fantastic for all of us, and we're very grateful for the time you've spent with us.
Thank you. And I would just respond back that you've been a wonderful group. I mean, it is constrained on the screen and I don't get lunch and so on like that. But nonetheless, great questions, great attention. I know everybody has other things to do, but I appreciate people thinking about these things and engaging. I always learn so much from events like this. So it's been wonderful though. So thank you so much. Yeah, hope we can do, I'll find my way to Calgary somehow. And if you're ever in the Boston area, any of you, let me know that you're passing through and we can have lunch or something like that.
Great.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Clooney. Again, thanks everyone for coming. And I don't actually know exactly if we have further plans for what the next. We have a chair of Christian thought professor here, and we have Craigie lectures that keep coming up too. If you would like to stay connected to those, what's the best way? Carolyn, can I have you unmute? Oh, good.
Yeah, yes, I could say that Tina Ruparel is giving us talk tomorrow evening at the Calgary Public Library on the theme of atheism. I think the talk is at 7 p.m. and you can register either via you could go to our university webpage, there'll be information there, or you can go to the Calgary Public Library. Is that right, Leslie? Did I get all that right? Yeah, good. Okay. Leslie organizes all these wonderful talks. So that's the next thing up on the list for discussion. And if I could just also add a great thank you to Dr. Clooney for these 3 days of just wonderful talks. It's really led me to reflect as well, and very timely. I teach a unit on monks, mystics, and reformers. And in the last class, I was speaking on Christian humanism to lead up to Erasmus and Martin Luther. And I was planning on teaching grace and free will, but the students really want to discuss Luther and Erasmus' reactions to Jews and the other. And I thought that was a really interesting, it was not in the reading at all, but it was something that was very important to them to explore. And I think a lot of the points that you raised, it's interesting that I think students are ready more than ever for this type of methodology, analysis, and approach to the study of religion, pushing me into that area as well.
Yeah. I think, I mean, that's another maxim of teaching. I mean, your flexibility in the face of what you intended to do and what the students wanted to talk about. I think I figured out somewhere over the years that if you ignore the questions that students actually have, that's a great learning block. Because, sorry, we're not talking about that, we're talking about this, and it doesn't work. And you somehow have to be inventive enough to take seriously questions that may disrupt your neat plan for the class and spin things in a new way. I mean, you basically want to keep steering things in some way, but where are your students and what questions do they have? In some ways is remedial because it makes up for the fact that you can't presume a common background anymore. You can't assume, 8 years of this education, 12 years of that education, but the questions they bring to you are like signals about what matters. And if you can bring those questions in any kind of interfaith context to bear, then obviously, with people of any age, I mean, older people, younger people, then obviously it'll work better if we get the sense, well, you're taking my questions seriously. So we try our best, right? Well, thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you. So Dr. Clooney, you're sitting at 1:30 where you are?
It's almost 1:30. So it's what, 11:30 there? It's time for lunch.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
we can't, we should send you skip the dishes, but it's a little late for that. It's not the right time.
No. Yeah, it's a bit quieter this week. I mean, obviously, how can things be quieter during a shutdown and a pandemic? But streets are emptier. Somehow people disappear during spring break, even though everybody sort of disappeared anyway. But it's quiet, so a week for doing interesting things. I think maybe originally we imagined maybe all the airports would be open, and this week I could actually fly to Calgary, and just in case it was spring break, but that didn't happen. So it's still a slightly more relaxed week, which is a good thing.
Very good.
Yeah. On another occasion, I realized I didn't take the time, but another course I'm doing, and I'll just say this and we can sign off. I'm team teaching a course with a Hindu Swami on Hindu ministry, Introduction to Hindu Ministry, because we're trying to start another track in the MDiv program. We have Christian, obviously, students who do it from a Jewish and Buddhist perspective. There's an effort to have Islamic ministry training. And we have about 15 students, most of them Harvard, but some from outside, trying to think about what is Hindu